Welcome to parallel session 15 on politics, selection, and candidacy. We have a packed program with 4 excellent papers. And I will be co-discussing with my colleague Dr. Umair Javed. We'll go in the order that's on the program, and we'll start with a presentation from Dr. Mariam Mufti from the University of Waterloo on candidate selection and its implication for legislative behavior in Pakistan. Dr. Mufti, go ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the conference organizers for putting this event together and for inviting me to participate. It's proved to be a wonderful 3 days with incredible panels, so thank you very much. Today, I'm presenting a chapter of a forthcoming book, and therefore, this is just one argument from a larger work on candidate selection in Pakistan that began several years ago and is based on very intensive fieldwork with Pakistani politicians, particularly from the 13th and 14th National Assemblies. Now, there's very good reason for why I did not extend to 2018, which will become apparent as I go through the presentation. But nonetheless, the findings of this work do apply to the later periods and definitely have a lot of implications for legislative behavior. Now, in other places and in other publications are focused on how candidate selection impacts party switching and party indiscipline. Today, I'm basically talking about how that plays out in legislative politics. Now, before I get started, however, there's a very, very important caveat, which is that in Pakistan, studying legislative behavior is actually very, very complicated. And the reason for that is that there's no roll call voting. And in fact, the Pakistani parliament, if you go through the rules of business, you'll realize that they do not, in fact, count votes. Voting in the parliament is very usually done by a show of hands, and the House either has it or it doesn't. And so to make any quantitative or empirical argument about legislative behavior is very, very difficult. Now, where votes are recorded is usually in cases of no confidence. However, that data is held very, very closely by the Speaker of the National Assembly and is hard to get a hold of. Besides which, there haven't been that many no confidence motions, even though we are a parliamentary system. And although one just happened, there haven't been that many, and therefore that data would not necessarily translate into a quantitative analysis. Nonetheless, how the parliament works and what exactly these politicians do in the parliament is of significance, and therefore we should pay attention to what kind of behavior we can anticipate from politicians. Now, with that, I will get started. It is well accepted by scholars of parliamentary political systems that the maintenance of a cohesive voting bloc is necessary for winning the parliamentary game. Party cohesion matters in the daily running of parliaments, and an identifiable voting bloc allows for the accountability of the executive to the legislature. Parties want to be represented in parliament as a cohesive voting bloc, one that can depend on its legislators to work together in the interest of the political party, not least in instances of no confidence motions or budget motions and so on. If legislators are not willing to toe the party line, party leaders are forced to control recalcitrant members through formal rules and regulations or by providing informal incentives. Therefore, one can say that when legislators vote as a bloc in parliament, it is because the members must agree with one another or because they were made to come together as a bloc. So, for example, Article 63A in our Constitution is an institutional mechanism by which party cohesion is enforced in Parliament. Now, there's much to say about that, and maybe you can talk about it in the question-answer session. So, institutional accounts of what causes party cohesion to vary focus on the impacts of constitutional factors. This is work by Carey and Shugart. The electoral system, work by Leiphart and Cox and Rosenbluth, and the party system, work by Giovanni Sartori. Today, however, I will argue that we also need to take into account candidate selection, practices carried out by political parties, because they too have a bearing on party cohesion and party discipline. The key nexus between candidate selection and party cohesion is the degree of influence that the national party leadership has over the candidate selection process. The logic being that these processes determine the direction of a candidate's loyalty, which may be directed either towards the political party, to the constituents, or in fact, politicians could be completely self-serving. Now, there are a couple of aspects of candidate selection that warrant examination. The first is the selectorate. The selectorate is basically that body that actually selects the candidates. And extensive work exists on selectorates all around the world that, within political parties that do the work of candidate selection prior to an election. Now, a selectorate could be composed of one person, several people, or many people. Right? At one extreme, the selectorate may consist of a single person, like in the case of MQM during the Altaf Hussain era, where only Altaf Hussain was responsible for the candidate selection decision, right? Or it could be extremely inclusive. It could actually consist of the entire electorate of the nation. So, for example, the US primary would be a case of inclusiveness in candidate selection. Another important dimension of the selectorate that we should pay attention to is where exactly the candidate selection is occurring, right? So that is the degree of centralization. Is it happening at the local level within the constituency by local party organizers, or is it in fact happening at the federal or central level, which would be a very, very centralized mechanism of candidate selection? The third aspect of candidate selection that is typically looked at is the criteria for selection, right? So what are the qualities that the selectors are looking for in their potential candidates? These qualities may range from loyalty towards a political party, history of political affiliation, their appeal, their political skills, their levels of education, and so on. Now, the trick with the criteria for selection, however, is that intuitively, one would say that a political party is going to choose the candidate who is the strongest and seems to do very well on all of these different qualities. However, the qualities that the gatekeepers, that is the political parties, want may not necessarily align with what the voters want, right? And that actually becomes really, really complicated. And so what I think scholars of candidate selection in Western European contexts have actually missed out, which I have tried to do for Pakistan, is to actually look at other variables that would tell us a lot more about the candidate selection procedure, which is to actually pay attention to the nature of the constituency. Now, the general consensus in the literature is that a centralized and exclusive method of candidate selection, which involves a small group or even a single individual at the national level, will induce legislators to respond to the political party and therefore result in the behavior of a party loyalist or somebody who's going to be very loyal to the political party in the parliament. The other is that a decentralized or inclusive selectorate, one which is large, comprising of several non-party members, will typically result in legislators who have low levels of party loyalty and cohesiveness. Now, intuitively, this makes a lot of sense, right? There are examples to suggest that, in fact, that is not necessarily what's happening in Pakistan. It could be true for a lot of the Western contexts, but in Pakistan, where you have typically centralized and exclusive candidate selection happening amongst many of the political parties. In fact, I would argue most of them, with the exception of maybe the MQM and the Jamaat-e-Islami, we actually see indisciplined, disloyal party members, right? So what exactly is happening in Pakistan? And that's where I suggest that we need to be looking at two more variables. The first one is the nature of the constituency. And when we look at the nature of the constituency, not just whether it is an urban constituency or a rural constituency, although that is quite important, or even where that constituency is, Sindh, Punjab, KPK, Balochistan, I'm suggesting that we need to pay attention to whether the seat is safe or whether it is competitive. If it is a safe seat, chances are that you're going to end up selecting people who will be loyal to the party message, because the political party actually has a lot of sway in a safe seat, and they're probably looking for someone who can mobilize the party vote, all right? But in a competitive constituency, all right, you're looking for someone who can mobilize not just the party vote, but their own personal vote and also sway the swing voter, right? In which case, you're basically looking for someone who is a local influential or otherwise what we know of as the electables, right? The second variable that I think we need to be paying attention to is the party finance link, right? And the party finance link is actually quite straightforward to understand. Where the political party is going to finance your electoral campaign, such as in the case of the MQM or in the case of the Jamaat-e-Islami, you're going to end up with people who are extremely disciplined when it comes to legislative behavior. But where you let your politicians finance their own campaigns, and for the most part in Pakistan, the campaign finance is an area that is completely chaotic. You're going to end up with politicians who actually are completely independent of the political party with respect to the success of their electoral campaigns, right? So these are the two additional variables that I suggest we also need to pay attention to. Now, when you pay attention to these things and when you look at the candidate selection processes, and I will get into that in the latter half of my presentation, what we end up with in Pakistan are 4 different types of candidates, okay? We end up with party leaders, constituency politicians, whom I have also referred to as party heavyweights in other publications, party workers, and independent electables, right? And to understand the differences amongst these 4 types of candidates and their legislative behavior, I present this 2x2 table, which is based on 2 attributes. One is loyalty to a political party, and the second is responsiveness to a constituency. Now, you could say, well, how is this helpful? Because there's 2 types of candidates in each of those boxes, and there's none in the 4th quadrant. So how exactly is this typology helpful? I suggest that this typology is actually instructional in a couple of ways, okay? One, that it actually shows that we cannot necessarily identify a single politician as being either this or that, number one, okay? The world is not that black or white, okay? But the second aspect of this, of course, is that our politicians are very often doing both. They're trying to be loyal to their political parties because they need their political parties to win, but at the same time are also trying to be very, very responsive to their constituencies because, of course, that is how they win their elections. And that is true simply because we are operating in a political system that is quite clientelistic in its setup, right? So if you look at this 2x2 table, right, the 2 attributes, responsiveness to a constituency and loyalty to a political party, here is how I differentiate the candidates, all right? I use the term constituency politician for those candidates who apply for a party ticket to boost their own personal vote in the constituency that they have nurtured over a long period of time. Although independent candidates also do that, the difference between the constituency politician and the independent candidate is that the latter does not require a party ticket and in fact runs as an independent. In the other quadrant, where you have high loyalty to a political party and high responsiveness to a constituency, you've got the constituency politician and the party leader. Those 2 can also be distinguished in 2 ways, all right? The first one would, of course, be that a constituency politician will typically contest the election from the same constituency again and again, whereas a party leader in Pakistan would typically contest from multiple constituencies in the same election, right? So Imran Khan in 2018 contested 5 different constituencies in all over Pakistan, right? And then eventually he gave up 4 of the seats, and when by-elections happened on those 4 seats, well, PTI won those districts, right? So it's a strategy as well. So that's one way you could differentiate the party leader and the constituency politician. But the second is that a constituency politician will typically aspire, for the most part, to cabinet positions, right, at the federal level or the provincial level. Constituency politicians very rarely will make it to the position of the prime minister because that's usually something that the party leader will typically get. The one time this did not happen was when Yusuf Raza Gilani was appointed as the prime minister, and he was a constituency politician who managed to jump and bridge the gap between these 2. So I would suggest, nonetheless, that this typology is instructional in that you can differentiate in the behaviors of these individuals, right? So let's then move on to their legislative behavior. Now, here's the rub. In Pakistan, like I said, we don't have roll call voting. We don't have numbers, so I can't give you hard data here. But what's interesting when you look at the legislative behavior in Pakistan is that for the most part, political parties in Pakistan appear to be quite cohesive. One wouldn't think that, but they're actually quite cohesive and unified in that party leaders, constituency politicians, party workers vote according to the party line. Now, is that because of 63A? No, it isn't. 63A is really just holding these people together in 3 circumstances. That's the budget motion, there's the no confidence motion, and one other aspect that I'm blanking on. Constitutional amendment, you're right. So then the question is, on all other legislative acts, how is it that these individuals are in fact acting so cohesively. Now, here's my explanation. My explanation is that party leaders are responsible for setting the legislative agenda. They're not the ones who are going to go against it, all right? Constituency politicians are interesting, however. They will vote with their party, especially if it forms the government, to ensure unhindered access to state resources. These politicians recognize that parliamentary cohesion is necessary for individual is necessary for the access of patronage and to get that steady access in particular. Party workers, on the other hand, who are so dependent on their political parties for their electoral success and also for their political careers, will also tend to vote in line with the political party. Finally, even the independent electables, who happen to be the most autonomous politicians, tend to vote in line because their interests are similar to the constituency politician. They also want unhindered access to patronage. So clearly, in Pakistan, it is possible for political parties to function as cohesive voting blocs. Yet this overt display of party unity in legislature must be taken with a grain of salt, because politicians very often stage walkouts. They abstain from voting to show their disagreement with a piece of legislation. At other times, defections and formation of forward blocs is quite common in our legislative assemblies. So this suggests that simply looking at legislative voting behavior for the most part is not sufficient to explain what exactly is going on. I will also go so far as to argue that there is a different rationale for towing the party line within the various political parties based on the candidate selection. So let me show you these two tables where I actually break down the types of candidates that political parties are bringing to the legislature, right? So this is the 13th Assembly and the 14th Assembly. The first table actually shows the PPP, PMLN, PMLQ, which was relevant back then, MQM, and the ANP. And what you'll see over here is that the two larger political parties, okay, have an overwhelming number of constituency politicians, a few party loyalists, because after all, those party loyalists who typically tend to be the party workers also need to be rewarded with party tickets, okay? And then at this point in time, the party leaders, who was the party leader at this particular time? Asif Ali Zardari, who in fact was not a prime minister, so he was not in parliament at the time. And then for PMLN, I was looking at this at a time when Nawaz Sharif had already been disqualified, so he'd also stepped away. So now, should we consider the person who was leading the PMLN caucus to be the individual? That would be the question, right? And then for MQM, what's interesting is that you'll mostly see party loyalists, all right? And then the ANP, that's a bit of a mixed bag. And if you look at the second table, all right, again, you will see a similar trend, right, where you have the PPP, the PMLN, PMLQ. PMLQ had pretty much been decimated by this time. But again, with the PPP and the PMLN, more constituency politicians, all right, very few party loyalists. MQM, mostly party loyalists. And then with the PTI, what you see is, again, a mixed bag. Interesting, more electables, all right? But what I'm not showing over here is the 2018 assembly, right, where the PTI's numbers change dramatically, right? And in fact, in 2018, what we also see is that with the MQM, the MQM is not as strong as a political party, and so their numbers also start to vary. Now, how is this all impacted by candidate selection? And that's what I'm going to try to do in the last 2 minutes. So that's basically over here. All the variables that I set up at the start of the presentation is basically what is being captured by this figure over here. All right, and here's what's interesting. In Pakistan, MQM, the PPP, and the PMLN all come off as being exclusive and centralized candidate selection, have exclusive and centralized candidate selection procedures, okay? However, the difference between the MQM, PPP, and the PML is that if you look at the party finance link, MQM finances the election campaign. And by virtue of doing that, it has a major prerogative over the party label and ends up selecting candidates who will toe the line no matter what happens and will be loyal to the political party when it comes to their legislative behavior. On the other hand, even though PPP and PML are centralized and exclusive, they do not finance the elections. That is the major difference. The second major difference between these three, amongst these three parties, is the nature of constituency. Please notice that MQM is mostly contesting safe and urban seats, all right? Whereas PPP and PMLN are contesting elections all over Pakistan, right? And so in the seats that are competitive, they actually do not have a prerogative over the party label and in fact have to look for the strongest candidate. Therefore, they go for the local influential that we know as the constituency politician. And we also know that the constituency politician likely to be loyal to the party line, but maybe not. That's what happened with Imran Khan. He couldn't keep his coalition together because in 2018, right before the no confidence motion, he was unable to actually maintain that party cohesion because he had such a large number of constituency politicians, right? So you start to now see the importance of what I mean by party cohesion in the legislature. Last thing I will do very quickly in the last minute is to talk about ANP and the PTI. Now, arguably, ANP is not necessarily the most important political party in our parliament, but nonetheless, a very telling example. It has a localized candidate selection procedure because candidates are actually selected provincially, not at the central level, as it is for all the other political parties, number one. Number two, the nature of the constituency is mostly safe. ANP contests seats mostly in KPK and some parts of Balochistan. Party finance link, the candidate finances the electoral campaign. So what does ANP end up with? A few, mostly party loyalists, right, because they're safe seats, but a few constituency politicians as well because they need candidates who can finance their electoral campaigns. So that's what's going on with ANP, but PTI, okay, that's what's most relevant to us right now. All right, PTI is interesting because PTI flip-flopped on its candidate selection procedures. And there's all kinds of organizational structuring that's been happening in the PTI, okay? Ultimately, in 2013, the candidate selection was done in a multi-stage way. So candidates were selected at the provincial level, and eventually Imran Khan said yes or no, which made it a very, very exclusive candidate selection procedure, all right? However, because Imran Khan at the same time had also promised that he would bring some party loyalists to the fore, you end up with more constituency politicians, but nonetheless a more significant number of party loyalists as compared to the PPP and the PML, right? And in 2018, that changes completely where it's mostly electables, right? It's mostly the constituency politicians, a whole bunch of independent electables who join Imran Khan and very few party loyalists, okay? And that's because the candidate selection procedures changed. So overall, when you look at how candidate selection impacts legislative behavior, I would argue that we need to add these variables, but as something Dr. Cheema said when Dr. Wanchikon made his presentation, we need to pay attention to party organization. So if you want to fix this, we need to really pay attention to what these larger political parties, particularly PPP, PMLN, and PTI, are doing with respect to their local party organizations. And that's pretty much the major implication of this work. But also, given what's going on in our country right now, especially with respect to the no confidence motion earlier this year, I think looking at candidate selection procedures and looking at party organizations is particularly instructive. Thank you so much.
Sorry. All right, so next up we have Dr. Adeel Malik, who's going to be presenting on frontier governmentality.
Thank you very much, Farah and Ali, for inviting me to present in this great conference. I've met a lot of old friends. This paper is about institutions and conflict, and it's about a particular institutional arrangement that existed in many colonies of the world, which was the way in which colonizers ruled the frontier territories differently than non-frontier regions. And so we look at the longue durée consequences of this for conflict. It's joint work with my longtime co-author, Rinchen Mirza from Kent University, and Faiz Rehman, who's also presenting another paper in this panel. Okay, so the study of conflict is a very well-traversed terrain. There's a lot of work about the long-term drivers of conflict. And indeed, there's also a lot of work about the role of institutions, how institutions foster conflict. But what is important about this literature is that the role of institutions is underspecified. We don't know a lot about specific institutional configurations and how they influence conflict. I'm going to zoom through some of the slides because this is a presentation I presented at LSE a couple of weeks back, 45 slides, so I don't want to bore you with those, and I want to remain within the 20-minute format. The starting point for this paper is that colonizers built different institutions and that colonialism itself was not a singular treatment. And this institutional heterogeneity is most visible when we look at the way in which colonizers ruled their frontier spaces versus non-frontier spaces. In the frontier spaces, they built more exceptional legal, political, administrative institutions, which were sort of hybrid institutions because there was a complex overlay of formal and informal institutions. Now, why did colonizers dealt with their frontier spaces differently? Well, there were at least three key factors. One was that they typically faced more intense external threat in their frontier territories. There was relatively limited potential to extract resources, so extending state authority was costly. And so for all these reasons, they basically created more exceptional imperial rule in frontier areas. There are lots and lots of examples globally of this phenomenon. If you look at the peripheral regions of European and Neo-European empires, even in the Ottoman Empire, we had similar institutional configurations. In our country, obviously, the FATA, which I'm going to focus more on, was a sort of archetypal example of frontier governmentality. And the same procedures were implemented in other colonies. In fact, people who were central to creating these different legal structures were then posted in different other colonies, different countries, and they basically replicated. In Nigeria, we have similar arrangement. In Kenya, you have the northern frontier with Somaliland. There's a special districts administrative ordinance. Pakistan's northwest, obviously, I talked about. India's northeast, and a whole range of other contexts. In fact, if you look at these maps are not very visible, but you have the northern province in Kenya, but you also have the Pakistani northwest frontier area, and so on and so forth. There's a great deal of cases that people have talked about, especially in the book by historian Benjamin Hopkins, who talked about ruling the savage periphery. And he describes this as, quote unquote, a globally ubiquitous phenomenon, that it was actually replicated very widely across different places. When we think about conflict, there is again literature, I'm going to skip this slide, but there's growing literature that talks about the role of this type of rule, institutional rule, on conflict. A more recent example is Adnan Nassim Allah's book, Patchwork States, the historical roots of subnational conflict, in which he talks about how the spatial framework of governance diversity, these different spatiality of institutional rule, and how that variation then maps on to post-colonial politics and shapes conflict. And in particular, he talks about how uneven presence of the state created different kind of state-society relationship, which obviously mattered for conflict in the long run. This book by Benjamin Hopkins, from where we borrowed this terminology, frontier governmentality, which is basically a set of administrative, legal practices, political practices that are termed as frontier governmentality. He talks about conflict, the long history of conflict being directly tied with the idea of frontier governmentality. Okay, our main hypothesis is that it's not just that these different frontier arrangements lead to more long-term conflict. In fact, we argue that frontier governmentality can maintain social order for a very long period of time. What is, however, important is that it's more susceptible to shocks. So in the face of shocks, it's less resilient. And why that is the case, there's a big literature on hybrid governance in political science, international relations, borderland studies, which talk about an inherent feature of such institutional arrangements being that it's a very fluid and unstable rule. It has a very, you need constant negotiation, bargaining between different parties, and therefore they are more vulnerable to shocks because the statehood, the very idea of statehood is negotiable and typically mediated through elites. There's a lot more reliance on elite intermediation rather than formal institutions. What we do in this paper is that we actually test this idea on Pakistan, and we utilize a historical boundary in Pakistan's northwest frontier, which most people in this audience would know about the FCR rule, the Frontier Crimes Regulation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that context. But we use that historical boundary, and we compile highly fine-grained data, 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell level data on conflict. And we set up a spatial regression discontinuity design, and really, as we say in economics, comparing the comparables, basically looking at the boundary and a conflict incidence very close to the FCR border, inside the FCR border versus outside. And we find that areas that are those 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells that are just inside the FCR border are exposed to more conflict in the long run. We conduct a variety of robustness tests, and I'll quickly flip through them in the course of my presentation. And then when we look at the mechanism, we basically highlight that this long-term propensity for conflict is really a post-9/11 phenomenon. And we look at how 9/11 was a sort of shock to grievance against the state, and that this effect is mainly activated after 9/11. And the primary mechanism through which it takes place is the removal of elites, the elites on which the whole institutional order was resting. Once they were eliminated, there was nothing to really withhold, to sort of, as a safety valve. So it's really a paper more about, as Adnan Nasimullah talks about, sort of sovereignty contesting forms of violence. And Adnan Nasimullah talks about how frontier governance arrangements created different type of conflict rather than sovereignty neutral violence, which really is mediated through political institutions, through courts, judiciary, and formal institutions of conflict management. We have a form of conflict that is more sovereignty contesting form of violence. So it's really conflict against the state that we are looking at. Very quickly, some context, although most of you would know about the arrangements in Pakistan. There's a large literature in anthropology and history that talks about frontier governance, and the classic example of it is the Frontier Crimes Regulation. There's a lot of work by Benjamin Hopkins that talks about those arrangements. Very, briefly recapping it, I mean, four key characteristics of it were that firstly, there was no access to formal institutions of conflict management. So that typically, even under colonial dispensation, you had some limited recourse to administrative structures, police, courts, and so on and so forth. But in these regions, you don't have those formal institutions. In fact, there's a different type of mechanism of conflict resolution that depends more on the Jirga system. It depends on the elite intermediation. These were tribal Maliks who would typically operate under a deputy commissioner, under the oversight of the colonial judiciary, but with considerable leeway. And of course, this is also an area where the state shares its power of coercion with local elites. So, local elites have the ability to hire, recruit tribal militia. And this clearly contrasts heavily with other parts. So really, the state authority does not extend very deeply in these regions, and the state's presence is very minimal or thin, and the relationship between the state and society is very differentially configured. So standard spatial RD specification, nothing unusual about it, just to highlight that YIS is the outcome variable of interest, 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell level. We are looking really at incidence of attacks against the state. And then we are looking at controlling for a number of factors that are important, very standard in the literature, geographic, climatic, but also more historic controls. So I'll explain them very quickly in the interest of time. The more important thing is that we are also controlling for 20 kilometer border level segment fixed effects. So border segment fixed effects, which is really makes this a more robust analysis. We also cluster the standard errors at the same FCR border segment level to account for spatial correlation. Now, few words about the different variables in the data sets. When we are thinking about the FCR border, obviously in the initial period, the FCR extended to large parts of Pakistan. But we are interested in the FCR border that remained for the longest period of time, and that's practically FATA and some adjoining regions. Conflict, again, very standard database, the GTD Global Terrorism Database that provides data from 1970 to 2019, again at the grid cell level. And we have fairly detailed information about the nature of the target, who claims the target, and so on and so forth. Couple of geographic controls that we need to make sure that they vary smoothly across the border. We control measures of slope, change in elevation, ruggedness using prior work by Nunn and Puga, topography. We also control for precipitation, temperature. There are a lot of these databases that are now available at a highly fine-grained level that we can easily control for. But two very important controls for analysis is sort of pre-FCR conflict to the extent that it can shape FCR arrangements. So we use this book, Jakes, by Jakes, that actually provide a lot of detailed historical information about pre-FCR conflict and goes far back in time. And also a measure of growth or development, which economic historians have typically concentrated on more like population density. So we have a measure of pre-FCR population density. So we control for these in our RD analysis more by way of precision, but we also show that many of these sort of observable features that might be linked with FCR arrangements originally vary smoothly across the border. Now, just a very quick look at the map for all of Pakistan, although analysis is really focused on the FCR regions. The thing that becomes immediately apparent is that the intensity of attacks, the sort of attacks against the state, is really high in this FCR region on the top left-hand corner. I'll flip through those and really focus on our baseline result, which is that we do find a very significant, statistically significant discontinuity in terms of conflict against the state in regions that are just inside the FCR border versus regions that are just outside the FCR border. While controlling for segment fixed effects, we have controls in column 2 as well. So there's a sense in which regions that are just inside the FCR border versus regions 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells that are just outside the FCR border, there's a real discontinuity in terms of attacks against states. So these are regions that are broadly comparable. Visually, if you use, whether you use the local linear or Giraldi plots, in both cases we find a very sharp discontinuity in terms of proclivity for long-term conflict. We also obviously look at balance between different kinds of these geographic and historic covariates. We do not find any significant discontinuity in those dimensions. So this is just a table, and you find that there's no statistically significant difference. But equally, we also find that in a lot of the dimensions that I highlighted, most of these variables vary smoothly across the border, which is very important for identification purposes. Okay, so I'm going to flip through these and get straight to a couple of tests that we did, and then really focus more on mechanisms. So we tried a number of things. Some of the tests are not here, but we tried quadratic fit. We did alternative kernel weights, manually imposed bandwidth selections. At the moment, the results are around buffer zones. So rather than 50-kilometer buffer zones on both sides of the FCR border, we look at 40 kilometers or 60 kilometers. We try and work with different kinds of border segments, so shorter border segment rather than 20 kilometer, 18 kilometer, or 15 kilometers. The results hold up, and there's a very, very robust feature of the data. So again, in terms of alternative measures of conflict, we looked rather than just on incidents of attacks against the state, we also look at injuries and those who are killed. Again, find a very strong pattern. And so this is all standard stuff for spatial RD or RD analysis. You do donut hole analysis as well, where you look at observations very close to the border might be driving the results. So you change the radius, and the results basically hold up. So what do I want to focus on in the next 5 to 7 minutes that I might have? Okay, great. Is that, in fact, in that case, I can just provide a sketch of the argument. I talked about frontier governance, and in which there are really two key aspects of it. One is limited avenues of conflict management, and there's also lower trust in the state in these regions. Now, this could still maintain social order, but in the face of shocks, and we show that the 9/11 induced shock to grievance against the state made this more sort of less resilient to shocks, make it more vulnerable. And why did it make it more vulnerable? Because there was over-reliance on elite intermediation. And once those elites were removed, there was no structure to really provide social order. So I'm going to provide quickly some results to support that. The first thing is obviously about fallout from the US war on terror. We find that anti-American sentiment really shoots up after the Musharraf period, and the series of polls that are consistently showing that. We couldn't find data before 2000, but you could see how throughout the country the unfavorable opinion remains significantly higher than those who consider the US favorably. And obviously 2011, you see a significant spike. What we do find in this analysis, if we will sort of decompose the analysis over time, and this is tehsil level across Pakistan and controlling for provincial fixed effects, the difference in conflict against the state really emerges after 9/11. So if you look at the pre-9/11 period, there's hardly any, despite a small spike, which is not significant. Really, the difference emerges after 9/11. So it's really a story about 9/11 induced shock that then leads to these effects. And so we could show it empirically. We could just look at the data post 9/11 and pre 9/11, and much of the significance that we are getting in our results is a post 9/11 phenomenon, which is on the right-hand side. We look at survey level data from FOF and other household level data sets, and look at estimate linear probability models where the dependent variable is whether the household had a recourse to an M&A or no contact with M&A in the last 2 months, how much of a recourse you find with the JAGA system. And again, the results controlling for a whole range of household characteristics, income, gender, et cetera, it's all noted down here. We find that in the FCR areas, there's a significantly less likely a recourse to the M&A and more recourse to the JAGA system. And there's also less trust in the state institutions, significantly lower trust in the parliament, district courts, so on and so forth. So lower trust in state institutions and less reliance on formal institutions of conflict management. So we then ask, what exactly is the mechanism? The prime mechanism in this context really was the systematic targeting and assassination of tribal elites. And again, you find, if you just look at attacks against tribal elders, you find that inside the FCR border, there's a significantly higher incidence of attacks against the state than just outside the border. Now, this obviously builds on a lot of prior literature that's talked about it. Obviously, in a more qualitative context. So Nasimullah's paper, one of his papers actually talks about how this systematic targeting of an assassination of tribal elites dealt a serious blow against the structures within tribal society because they were the primary interlocutors with the state. And it basically led to a disruption of frontier rule, which lies at the heart of political disorder. Obviously, he also talks about the destruction of the regular means of communication that these elites provided. And once they were removed, there was nothing to withstand that shock. And actually, if you look globally, at different insurgent movements in Africa or Latin America, for example, you find the same evidence. So I stumbled on a report in Reuters in 2021, a very detailed report, which basically reviewed a lot of cases in Kenya, in Nigeria, and a whole range of other African contexts where systematically the issue being pointed was very similar, which is that if you want maximum disorder, you kill the chief because he's really holding the main social structure. And if the agenda is to replace the state, killing the village chief is just the beginning of the process because then the whole thing unravels. So 0 minutes left, and I think I've already explained. I don't need to go over again, except for the final point. What is the implication of these results? I mean, it's basically telling us that conflict incidence is likely to be higher in regions where state authority is weakly penetrated, state-society relations are predominantly controlled by and mediated by local elites, and populations, local populations have limited recourse to institutions of conflict management. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Faiz Rehman from Azam University, who will be presenting on political dynasties and local economic development in Pakistan.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you to the organizer for the invite. As we know that political dynasties in Pakistan exist since its independence. However, the discussion about the economic performance of dynastic legislature versus non-dynasty has been actually started in the last decade or so with the emergence of a new political party, that is Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. When it started, or you can say it increased the intensity of this debate between the economic role of the dynast versus non-dynast. Now, dynasties are not only limited to the political market or the political system. Dynasties exist everywhere and in every field. I will provide you some figures that on the average, a child is 5 times more likely to enter into the occupation of his or her parents. However, this probability or likelihood is significantly high in politics. It is 10 times more likelihood that a child of a politician will enter into politics. So it is more than double than some of the elite occupations like medicine and law. And interestingly, the occupation of economists, our occupation, there is a 63 times more likelihood that our children will become economists. Now, if we come to politics, currently 15% of the leaders, 15% of the leaders of countries' leaders are currently the descendant of former leaders. So dynasties exist everywhere in every country and in every field. Initially, in the last decade, the debate between dynast and non-dynast has been started about the inexperience and patronage. The dynastic politicians, they argue that they are more experienced because they endowed both human capital and physical capital, human capital in the form of skills and resources, political capital in the form of brand name, political networking, loyal voting, etc. So they are relatively in a better position to play a better role or to provide quality public goods and services into the voters because they are more experienced. On the other hand, the non-dynast politicians, they argue that the dynast politicians do not have an incentive because of the loyal voters, and if they do not have incentive, they will not provide any public service. So in this study, we have tested a research question that is, does dynastic persistence affect the local economic development at the constituency level? Now, let me provide some figures about the dynastic persistence within a party. This slide actually shows the distribution of dynastic winners for main political parties for the 2002, 8, and 13 elections. And interestingly, if you see that 59% of the winners in the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz group were having dynastic roots. In the People Party, it was 61%. For the PTI, if we include 2018, because in 2008, it didn't participate in the election, it is more than 52%. For the Pakistan Muslim League Q, it is 67%. So it shows that how entrenched dynastic politicians are in the political system of Pakistan. Now, before going to further detail about the economic performance of a dynastic politician, let me provide some correlation between dynasty and some economic variables. So this graph actually shows the relationship between multidimensional deprivation index and the share of a dynastic politician who contest in an election in a constituency. So as the share of a dynastic candidates in a constituency increases, that constituency is highly deprived of main facilities. It means that as the share of dynastic politician in a constituency, when they contest an election, it increases, it decreases the competition in that constituency. And it also increases the probability that dynasty will win. Again, this is the correlation between dynastic politician share in a constituency and nighttime light. And I will be focusing more on this nighttime light because at the constituency level in a country like Pakistan, we do not have socioeconomic indicators. So basically, nowadays, majority of the researchers, they are using nighttime light as an indicator of economic activity or an indicator of economic development. And again, there is a negative relation between the mean of night light and share of dynastic candidates in a constituency. Now, I will summarize this, that the past literature shows that dynastic politician, the constituency of a dynastic politician, where a dynasty wins, have low economic growth, it has a high crime rates, it has a low competition, and it has a low quality of public goods and services. Now, again, let's come to the situation in Pakistan. One of the earlier work on the political dynasties is from Dr. Cheema and his co-authors. And they have observed that around 600 families in Pakistan, they have dominated the political market of Pakistan since 1970. And very recently, a study by Dr. Adeel and his co-author, they have observed a negative effect of a political dynasty on some of the economic outcomes in Punjab. And interestingly, if you look at the number of dynastic candidates winners in the National Assembly of Pakistan, it is more than 50%, it is around 52% that the member of parliament have dynastic roots. Now, in a study like political dynasty, it's very challenging to identify a politician being a dynasty or a non-dynasty, because one has to trace the family tree of a politician, and one has to find whether his or her parents or uncles, brothers, sisters, were they in politics or not, were they a member of parliament, and so it is one of the challenge in a study like this. According to our results, we have observed that in the three elections, 2008 and 13, 52% of the parliamentarian in the National Assembly of Pakistan were belong to dynastic families. Interestingly, 42% of the runner-up were having dynastic roots. And if we come to the constituency level, just before the election, when they contest an election, so more than 22% of the candidates who contest in an election in a constituency were having a dynastic background. So basically, the problem starts from the constituency level. That is, the problem starts when they contest an election. And whenever there is a high number of dynastic candidates, when they contest an election in a constituency, it significantly decreases, or you can say discourage, the non-dynastic candidates to contest election against the dynast. This graph is basically based on the previous information, and the interesting point about this graph that there is no change, there is no variation in the graph in the 2002, 8, and 13 election. So the blue bar shows the winner, dynastic winners. The red shows the runner-up, dynastic runner-up, and the green is for those who secured the third position. And if you look that out of 272 direct election constituencies, more than 50% had won by dynastic candidates, and there is no variation at all. It means they have captured the political market in such a way that it's almost impossible to change over the time. Now, a few words on nightlight and economic development. As I discussed, that data at the very granular level or at the constituency level in a country like Pakistan, it's very hard to find, or we do not have data on socioeconomic indicators. So since the last decade, political scientists and social scientists, they are increasingly using the use of nightlighter as a measure of economic development or economic activity. And there are a lot of studies which have observed a positive correlation between nighttime light and economic activities or economic development. A recent work by in KP, it has observed a positive correlation between night luminosity and district level GDP, and that is why we are using a nightlight as a measure of economic development. Again, just to confirm the relation between nightlight and some constituency level infrastructure, this graph shows that as the nightlight in a constituency increases, it has relatively more infrastructure in the form of roads, access to school, health facilities, etc. This is just a snapshot of how nightlight looks like in Pakistan. For this study, we are utilizing a methodology which is regression discontinuity design in a close election scenario, in which we compare the performance of a dynast winners who defeat a non-dynast with that of a non-dynast who defeats a dynast. So in a close election scenario, why we are taking a close election? If a dynast wins again a non-dynast, let's say by 3% or 5% margin, so there is a high probability that this winning margin would be random. And other characteristics of a dynast like political capital or experience may not play a significant role in the winning. So on the left-hand side, it's the outcome variable, the dependent variable, which is a nighttime light in a constituency C in a time T. On the right-hand side, dynast is a time variable having value of 0 and 1, and the victory margin is the margin of victory a dynast or non-dynast wins from their respective counterparts. So this graph is based on the previous equation, and it shows a clear discontinuity between the economic performance of a dynast or a non-dynast, or you can say nighttime light in the dynast constituencies versus the non-dynast constituencies. The left-hand side, these are the constituencies of non-dynast, the right-hand side of the dynast. And there is a clear discontinuity that dynast candidates, if he or she wins in the 3 election, so there is a high probability that dynast candidates will underperform relative to non-dynast candidate. This is the case for Punjab and Sindh, and again we see the same results, that a dynast candidates relatively underperform in terms of economic development to that of non-dynast. Interesting observation is for the KP. It is insignificant that there is no significant difference between the economic performance of a dynasty and that of non-dynasty, and one of the reasons could be that in KP, generally people vote on the basis of performance rather than on the basis of a loyalty, etc. These are the regression results. I will just explain, because I'm time constrained, the column 1. And it shows that having a dynastic legislature decreases nighttime growth by almost 1 percentage point. And I will explain in the later slide that 1 percentage point is a big difference in terms of economic development. And then we also repeat the exercise for the 3% margin of win, 5%, 7%, and also control the results for covariates at the district level. Now, one of the questions when we were doing this study, that during after 2007 or 8, there was an energy crisis, there was a high load shedding across Pakistan. So nightlight may not capture the true effect of economic development in Pakistan at a constituency level. The second question or observation was that majority of the dynastic candidates are having from the rural areas. And generally, electricity in the rural areas is always low as compared to the urban centers. So it would be better to compare rural area constituency rather than urban centers. So we were lucky to have data on rural constituencies, which is provided by Pakistan Rural Household Panel Survey. It provides a comprehensive data on economic indicators at the constituency level, that is access to electricity, access to sewage system, transport, water, etc. And again, it shows that having a dynastic legislature in a constituency in the rural area will have less electricity, less access to other facilities. Again, it shows that a dynastic winner underperform related to non-dynasty in terms of access to electricity, that is around by 28%, access to sewage gas, telephone, and paved roads. These are the effects of having dynastic legislature on economic indicators like consumption, land wealth, and non-land wealth. Now the question is that what is the mechanism through which a dynastic legislature would have effect on the economic indicators in a constituency? So one of the mechanism would be that having a dynastic candidate in a constituency will decrease the probability of non-dynasts to compete against a dynasty. That is, it decreases competition at the constituency level. And as I discussed earlier, that the problem starts from there. The low number of contested candidates in a constituencies, there would be high probability that a dynasty will win. So this graph shows the relationship between as the number of dynasts increases to contest in an election in a constituency, the number of candidates in that constituency significantly decreases. So it actually decreases local political competition. And low competition means that in that constituency, there is a high probability that people will vote less because those who do not want to vote to the dynasts are there. The dynasts have loyal voters. Similarly, in that constituency, there is a high probability that they would have low political knowledge, they would have low preferences for democratic values, and they would have low trust in the institutions. That is why they vote to the dynasts, because they trust more on the informal institution rather than the trust on the formal institutions. So to conclude this, a 1 percentage point is the difference in economic development between a constituency at the 50th percentile and 5th percentile of the distribution. In terms of district, it is the difference between Gujarat and Dijihan, and those are from Punjab. They would know that Gujarat is relatively more developed than Dijihan. In KP, it is the difference between Haripur and Lucky Marat. Haripur is relatively more developed than Lucky Marat, and the same for the other provinces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have another paper on dynasties, which will be presented by Dr. Ali Cheema, Institutional Change and Dynastic Persistence in Pakistan.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think sort of Mariam and Faiz Rehman have set up this talk quite nicely. I don't think I want to kind of delve into this question of, how severe dynastic persistence is and what its implications are. So I want to kind of take my cue from Leonard's talk this morning. There's a big literature that's emerged, not only on Pakistan, but across the world in the past decade and a half, which is measuring dynastic persistence. And we know, basically, that dynastic persistence in many contexts is quite high and persistent. There's a really nice paper by Daniel Smith, which is a review article which has just come out, which is worth reading. So the question that I want to really probe, and I think that's where the literature is stuck, that this is structurally such an entrenched equilibrium that how do you move the needle? And that's what this paper is trying to get with, which I'm doing with Farooq Nasir, who's here, and Luke Sonnet. So our big question is what types of reforms have the potential to erode dynastic advantage? And what we do, and I'm going to jump right in, I'm not sort of going to spend too much time in the literature, I'll draw some of it in. We study the impact of two electoral reforms that were introduced in 2002, and we use quasi-experimental methods to see the impact that they had on dynastic advantage. The first was reapportionment, which is basically two things, which is the increase in the size of the House. But for those who are invested in electoral processes, when you increase the size of the House, what happens is that the number of constituency changes at the district level. And so does the structure of the constituencies. The second is education minimums. We've all been through that, at least some of us. Some people might be too young to remember. But in 2002, Musharraf brought in a law which put up education qualification requirements, which then subsequently led to disqualifications, which remained in place till 2013. So we want to really look at what these two reforms, how they affected dynastic persistence. And what we find, and I'm just going to put out the effects and the findings and then sort of take you through the paper, that while the reapportionment reform diluted dynastic advantage, immediately in 2002 after the reform was introduced, and effects continued to persist until 2013, which is the period that we're looking at like Faiz. We look at 2002, 2000, and 2013. We don't see any effects of the education minimums that were put in place. All that we see is that there is a churn within dynastic families. So some people get disqualified and other members of the family come in. Why is this important? I mean, for us, this is important because if we're invested in inclusive representation, then we should take this question seriously. Faiz's kind of work, which is also showing basically that there may be developmental effects of this structure, makes us, invest even more into this question. But if you look at the Pakistani context, what you see, this is kind of the share of dynastic persistence across a whole range of countries. So this is combining our data with data from Daniel Smith's book. And the black bar is Pakistan. So this is kind of like Pakistan is a huge outlier, right? So we need to take this question seriously in the context that we're in today. But I think what's equally important is, and this goes back to sort of a question that Mariam ended with, that dynastic persistence has serious impacts on the cohesion of parties, right? I love this quote. This is an interview by Jahangir Tareen. Anybody who wants to understand Pakistan's politics should listen to this interview. I can send you the minutes you should listen to. This is with Nadeem Malik. This is kind of like when Jahangir Tareen was kind of nudged out, and the kind of quotes, he said, we lost the 2013 elections badly, only a few seats were rigged. I went to Imran Khan and said, if you want to be PM, we need to bring in political families, right? In 2013, we won 67 seats in Punjab. This is now the shift from 2013 to 18. And 80% of our winners are from those families. And 60% of those didn't contest on a PTI ticket in 2013, right? So these are really fluid parties. And if you look at what happened around the vote of disqualification, you'll probably end up with similar stories being told by Imran Khan today. So we want to kind of set up the electoral reforms. So let me just take you through it. So if you look at the 2002 reapportionment, what this graph is showing is the size of the House from 1970 to 2018. It baffles me that there's been no debate on the question on the size of the House in Pakistan. What you'll see is the House hasn't really changed much. And it's just changed in 2 election waves. So the House increased in 77. It went from 134 to 200. And pretty much remained static. And then there was a jump in 2002 to 272. This is of general seats. And since then, the size of the House has not changed. But unfortunately, as we saw from earlier speakers, the population of Pakistan has expanded massively. So today, you're talking about MNA constituencies which are close to about 1 million voters, right? And that has serious implications. But how do we think about sort of this increase in the size of the House? And we're looking at this change between 97 and 2002. The way we are thinking about it is you can think about reapportionment, because when the size of the House increases, seat allocations at the district level changes. We can think of it as a constituency level shock. So it's a shock that in some sense, for those districts that receive extra seats, what you've done actually is that you've lowered entry barriers and increased competition, because suddenly constituencies have become smaller, but also you made, to use Mariam's term, the selection process much more contested, right? So the district level bigwigs now have to contend with players, and the equilibrium arrangements have come under threat. This kind of nice evidence on redistricting, and it shows that redistricting hurts incumbents, but there's recent literature from 19th century UK. There's a nice paper by Van Copanello, which basically shows that in 19th century UK, redistricting had a big shock on dynastic advantage. We also know basically that party-based systems, the systems that don't privilege personal votes of candidates, but they basically give an advantage to the party vote. So these are party-based systems, like PR-based party systems. They also shock dynastic advantage a lot. So what we are basically seeing is that reapportionment we are kind of positive about, that it should have an effect, or it should erode or shave off a part of the dynastic advantage. What about the education minimums? So what this graph is showing, it's showing constituency election waves, and it's showing across these constituency elections, pairs. You can see this is a 2002 disqualification. This is just the disqualification that happened around 2002. We have a lot of variation. So there are lots of constituencies that didn't see any disqualification, some that saw tremendous amounts, and then, but how do we think about this? So this is like more a candidate level shock, right? So the candidate kind of is dislodged, right? So what the shock does is it creates a demand for new candidates, right? But the challenge, and it's interesting, we went back to the whole debate around this reform. And one of the things that smaller parties were talking about, they basically argued that the reform would fail because powerful families are very well placed to put a replacement candidate, right? So all you're going to get is displacement, right? And there's an interesting literature, there's nice work by Le Bon and co-authors, which basically looks in Philippines, which is another country with very high dynastic incidence, which has term limits. And they see that with term limits, basically it has no effects on eroding or shaving off dynastic advantage. So our expectation would be that minimums won't work, but reapportionment would. So I just want to quickly go over the data. I know, Sarah, how much time do you have? Okay, so I better go through this. And this is kind of like, we were the first ones we spent about a decade collecting this data. We made it public before we published very much, and it's created a public good, which is nice to see. So basically, this is an original data set of family membership of legislative candidates between 1970 and 2013. It traces kinships. It was constructed in collaboration, basically, with the Dawn group of newspapers, particularly with the Monthly Herald, through their district correspondence. And then we did a lot of verifications by actually meeting politicians to verify. Basically, our dynastic measure is ever having had a family member elected to an office in an election wave that preceded the wave of interest. So basically, which is pretty standard in the literature, so if I'm talking about 1997, did I have a family member who was elected to office in the preceding wave? So it's basically captures being connected to a powerful political figure. I want to kind of like lay out the outcomes because the outcomes for the two reforms are slightly different. So for reapportionment, we're going to look at 3 sets of outcomes at the constituency level and some set of outcomes at the district level. So it's dynastic candidate wins, whether the constituency is won by a dynastic candidate. This is a binary variable. The dynastic candidate vote share, so the share of the top 3 candidates' vote that is won by dynastic candidates in the constituency, incumbent wins. And then at the district level, we'll also look at the number of dynastic candidates competing and winning at the district level. For education minimums, because we're interested in this question of displacement. So in addition to dynastic candidates win, we also look at first-time dynastic candidate wins and first-time non-dynastic candidate wins, because that can sort of get us to see whether we have kind of some change. So let me kind of like now go a little bit to method and then to results. So what we do is the reapportionment in 2002 was a formula-based reapportionment. So we use a quasi-experimental design, basically an RD. The way it worked is that basically at the provincial assembly level, seats were allocated to representatives from different provinces, and a quota was calculated, which you can see this is the national quota for NWFP. They took the population in the 1997 census. Remember, this delimitation was happening 4 years later. They divided this number by the number of seats that were allocated, and you got basically a national quota for the province and a provincial quota for the province, right? Then what they did was that they basically, for every district assembly, right, so let's say Attak National Assembly, they looked at the 1998 population and they divided the population by the quota for that province, right? So this is the Punjab national quota. And what you get is you get a seat share. So this is the assignment of seats because the size of the house, that's going to go to Attak. But what they do is that basically the determination of the seats happens in terms of what the fraction is. So if we're looking at a bin of an allocation of between 2 to 3 seats, and you get a fraction above 2.5, you're going to get the third seat. But if you get below 2.5, you basically will get 2 seats, right? So this is the variation that we play on. So we say that this rounding creates a series of discontinuities at each 0.5 level. So we have these kind of seat share bins, and then we see basically what the fraction was based on the formula and whether you get the extra seat or not. So this is kind of a series of experiments, as it were, where we're basically saying that the district falls on one side or the other of the cutoff will, so there's similarly placed districts within similar bins, but whether they get the extra seat or not is random, right? What we are going to use is a data set which is at the constituency election level. I'm not going to go through numbers. If people are interested, I'll come back to this. And this is the kind of estimation that we do. So outcomes I've already defined. So the outcomes, this is the treatment variable. So we do ITT, basically, which is the treatment indicator for a district D being above the threshold for the assembly seat assignment, right? And we put in bin fixed effects, basically, which are for the district assembly level. So this is treatment effects with bin fixed effects, and then we have provincial election wave fixed effects that we put in, and we cluster our standard errors at the level of the treatment unit, which is the district assembly. So these are the main results for reapportionment, and what we see, and I'm presenting you the results for all the years, so you can see, remember our treatment happens in 2002, so this is a one-time reapportionment, and this is kind of dynastic candidate wins, and you see once the treatment happens, dynastic candidates wins actually fall, so it's a pretty large fall. It's about an 11 percentage point decline in dynastic candidate wins, which remains at fairly similar levels in 2008, but there's some shaving off of that win advantage. But if you look at the dynastic candidate share of top 3 votes, you have a persistent change, actually. And this is a pretty large drop in the vote share of dynastic candidates, which tells us that basically dynastic capture is getting more contested. When you look at incumbency, you have a 1-year effect of treatment, basically, but it kind of shaves off. But the reason we are also presenting these pre-treatment outcomes is because we just wanted to kind of show that we wanted to rule out that we're not getting any differences between treatment and control in the leads up to the reform. So why are dynasts winning less often? So we look at the extensive margin. So this is now at the district level. And what we basically see is this because less dynasts were winning, right, in treated districts, or districts that got the extra seat versus districts that didn't? Or is it that dynasts were running less candidates? And what we find is that basically it's not like in treated districts there are more dynasts who win. It's just that dynasts are not actually putting up the extra candidate, right? So we don't get significant effects. And now that comes to Mariam's story, and that's kind of like where this paper is a little bit stuck about like mechanisms. Is this because families don't have the strength to put up an extra candidate, or is it that the selection, the parties see this as an opportunity to say, oh, we're going to block this family from getting extra capture, right? But that's a question. But these effects are large, right? I mean, these are not kind of small effects. So if you look at education minimums, I'm going to go through this quickly. The data comes from Adeel, another person we taught, and we benefited from her. She collected this data and was part of her thesis. So this is disqualification data. This is only for MNAs. By the way, the previous analysis is for MNAs and MPA constituencies. This is an analysis is only for MNA constituencies. So here the treatment effect is basically the share of MNAs that were disqualified in 97, essentially, once the law came in 2002, basically, once the law came in. And again, the treatment now is basically at the district level. We can't do it at the constituency level because the constituencies got delimited, so we can't match pre and post constituency, so everything is collapsed at the district level. So again, it's district election waves. Here what we see is this is now basically 2002. This is dynastic candidate wins. You see going past 2002, minimums don't disturb dynastic advantage at all. But when you look at dynastic first-time wins, what you see is once the disqualification happens, there's a huge jump in dynastic first-time winners, which effectively gets reversed mechanically in the next election wave. And when you look at basically non-dynastic first-time winners, there's a drop, which is kind of in line with what we would expect. So this kind of like is also interesting for theory because there's this kind of literature about the iron law of oligarchy, which is as kind of these structures develop, you start to dismantle them, and all you do is, you know, like the more things change, the more things remain the same. So it's churning, basically. So I want to kind of sum up, and I think there are questions for policy here. Every time, you know, I've been invested in the dynastic politics debate with Dr. Farooq Nasir here for about a decade. And it's like, I keep like hearing this thing, nothing can be done about it. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's dynasticism everywhere. So, you know, economists are dynasts, dentists are dynasts, so why worry about kind of politicians? I mean, I have a different answer to that. The thing is, things can be done about it. And I want to go back to Leonard's talk in the morning. There are kind of institutional things, but we have to know what to do. And I think that, you know, sort of redistricting or reforms that weaken the personal vote clearly have effects. This is not just coming from our paper, it's also from these other papers. I mean, the other literature is also showing that we have to think about the mode of election. I mean, it's very interesting if you go back to the history of first-past-the-post system. I don't want to completely dump on first-past-the-post. I see some advantages. It was basically, it came about in the UK where powerful conservative landlords brought this as the reform. If you see progressive movements in Europe, they all moved away from, there was a lot of debate, but they never invested in first-past-the-post system. All labor parties all over Europe basically fought for party-based PR systems. And the literature from both Norway and Japan is showing that the shift towards party-based PR systems basically dented dynastic advantage. Now, maybe we can't do it at the provincial and national level, but I know that there was a 2019 Punjab Local Government Act which brought in a party-based local government system, which was replaced by Mussolini's electoral system, but that's another story. The other thing which is amazing is that basically we've had no debate on what the size of the legislature should be. This is just a graph which is plotting the size of the legislature against populations, right? This is Pakistan, right? You look at these countries like UK, Japan, you know, these are all smaller countries with much bigger houses. So it's not that we don't have elasticity here, right? But there is actually no debate about what the size, I mean, it kind of like baffled me when the 2018 election happened, and it's significant because there was an election act of 2018 which was passed with a lot of debate. But actually there was no debate about the size of the legislature, right, in this country. And I think that, you know, we have to, this is again going back to Leonard, we have to get invested in these questions because they are meaningful. Sarah's a hard taskmaster. So I'm just going to make one last thing. And this has implications for delimitations at other levels of government. I mean, the big debate around local governments in Pakistan is whether they should be at the district or at the tehsil level. I know we have friends from the bureaucracy who love the district as a unit, but it has serious implications for capture, right? Because tehsils mean you have much smaller constituencies, and districts mean you have this kind of entrenched constituencies that you are empowering now. So again, these are things we need to debate, and I'll end there. Thank you.
So if I could ask all of the panelists to please come up, and also my co-discussant, Dr. Javed.
All right. Thank you to all the panelists for their wonderful presentations and some really insightful work. And I think just generally keeping up with the theme of the conference, the fact that there's so much interesting empirical work coming out of Pakistan is just, yeah, it's plugging in a number of gaps that we've had for a very long time. As co-discussant with Dr. Sarah Khan, I'll be discussing Dr. Adeel, Malik, and Dr. Mariam Mufti's paper. Specifically, I'll start with Dr. Adeel's. I know you went second, but I had sort of a couple of comments that I sort of wanted to get out. I think it's an excellent paper. It's a long-standing question on sort of colonial origins and institutional forms that exist and their impact on contemporary consequences. I think that's just I think this is a really interesting example and one that has profound implications for conflict, security, citizenship rights in our particular context. And it's quite clear that the specter of hybrid governance, it looms large on Pakistan. So really, I think that paper brings out those things quite clearly. The use of an external shock with 9/11, I think that's again, I can't comment because of my own limitations on the methodological aspects of the paper, but I think the external shock aspect is quite interesting. The rise of internal grievances, in particular around Pakistan's alignment with the US after the, once the war there commences, I think it certainly does give rise to particular types of violence, and the conflict data through other data sets, such as the BFRS data set, also reaffirm the same pattern, which show a large uptick from what the baseline condition was in these parts of Pakistan. So I think there is, there's a lot of interesting validation with the data that you've presented as well. So I had a couple of questions, and these relate to some of the points that you mentioned in the paper. The first was this divergence between the reliance on tribal leaders versus reliance on MNAs or lack of access to MNAs. And so, there's a general conception that MNAs or local politicians tend to be from elite backgrounds themselves. And if this divergence exists and it provides an opening for this particular type of external shock to have an impact on violence and lack of access to justice, I'm wondering if this is something that has something to do with the electoral system or the institutional arrangement at that particular point, which bifurcated democratic representation from tribal representation or from tribal institutions. I think that's something that just came up while I was looking at the paper itself. Then a second point was simply on the process of elite reformation, which is that once you have elites that are taken out, what does the period of protracted violence look like after it's being resolved in some form, or the reassertion of sovereignty? In particular, the rise of FATA reforms and integration into provincial institutions of governance. So if there's something that could be said about that. And then a third point was about gradations of institutional heterogeneity. Now, I'm having a hard time phrasing this, but basically my point is that we have a very stark example of FCR versus non-FCR institutional heterogeneity and the impact that has on conflict and violence. But what we know from the history of colonialism in South Asia, and especially in this part, is that there are also institutional heterogeneities of other forms that weren't as stark as FCR versus non-FCR. I'm thinking about village governance, for example, between proprietary villages and canal colony villages, but also in other arrangements such as the provincially administered tribal areas in Malakand and in South Punjab. So I was wondering if that same analysis can be used to uncover maybe impact of conflict or the existence of conflict in those regions, and if that's something that you've considered. Specifically maybe around the Nizam-e-Adil ordinance and obviously the insurgency in Swat. So that's one thing that came to mind. So quickly moving on to Dr. Mufti's paper. So great paper, as I mentioned earlier as well. I think we have, so as someone who sort of occasionally does talk about politics here, I feel we use so many terms so loosely, and it's so great to see a typology that sort of helps us make sense of a reality that we're all familiar with, but we oftentimes can't phrase accurately enough. So having that typology and sort of creating a way to discuss actual variation which has amongst politicians and which has tangible consequences for electoral outcomes, and especially for government and party strength, given what we've seen over the last few months. I think that's great. So one thing that I wanted to, and this is sort of me projecting, but it's not necessarily something that needs to be addressed, but can we speculate on a theory for what type of progression takes place between candidates over a period of time? So people who move through candidate types and these categories, depending on, again, their political career, changes in, again, party strength, and so on. There have been a number of candidates, for example, Shahid Ka Kanabasi, who's a constituency politician, but has now become a party leader, has contested in multiple locations. We've had Javed Hashmi in the past. And then in urban areas, in Lahore in particular, we've had politicians who've been taken around in different constituencies. So that's, I think, one area, if we can have a theory of progression as far as candidate type is concerned. And then secondly, again, you mentioned this a couple of times in your presentation. We don't have voting data as far as it works in the legislature. But is there any thinking on how we might be able to sort of get a better sense of how these types actually perform as far as legislative behavior is concerned? And yeah, so I'd be open to hearing what sort of speculation we have as far as that's concerned. But yeah, those are my points. Thank you once again for those presentations.
Great. So I'm going to discuss the two papers on dynastic politics together. They both start from this baseline understanding of just how pervasive dynastic politics is. And Dr. Faiz Rehman's paper lays out what that means for development outcomes. And Dr. Cheema and co-author's paper talks about how we can curb this entrenched power of dynasticism. So turning first to Dr. Faiz Rehman's paper, I want to start with the importance of the descriptive results that I was sort of struck by. And the first of them is the prevalence of dynasticism across different political parties, which I think is an important point to make. And it goes back, I think, and ties nicely to the typology that Mariam had, is that the places that we see the difference emerge between political parties that are contesting within similar institutions and similar incentives is where they choose to contest and whether they have national aspirations or not. And so when a party has national aspirations, it seems that there's little choice but to engage in a politics that relies heavily on dynastic candidates. And so I want to just bring that out from the descriptives and also from that kind of highlight the value of the data set that both of these papers draw on for kind of having the informed debate that we're able to have today about dynastic politics. And as Faiz had a very nice picture of the two newspaper articles, that debate has now been politicized. And in a sense, because of this data set, we're in a position where we have leverage where we've been thinking about this debate in academia for longer. And so it's a nice space, I think, for that kind of, for that debate to, for academics to come in on that debate. The other thing about your paper, Dr. Faiz, is that I understand the importance of the regression discontinuity for the estimation of the causal impact of a dynast closely winning. But because competition seems so important to the story, I'm wondering what it is that we miss out on by not looking at a comparison between competitive and non-competitive areas. And so in a sense, when we're looking at these closely contested areas, are we in fact getting a low estimate of these effects of these perverse effects of dynastic candidates on development? The other thing I wondered was you show us you show us very clearly on average that there are negative impacts of having a dynastic candidate. I'm also wondering who wins, right? Who gains from having a dynastic candidate, and whether there's something you can, whether this is a possible extension to show us the impacts on inequality and concentration of wealth that is happening simultaneously as we see this very convincing evidence that you show us of deprivation and development decreasing in those areas. I was also very struck by the provincial differences that you showed, and I think there I wanted to point to work by Siddharth George in India, where he shows an initial positive impact of dynastic founding candidates that then tapers away with time. And so I'm wondering, I know that there's limited election data that you can look at, but perhaps looking at the dynamics over time would be really interesting, so you can maybe get at some of why that provincial difference might exist. I think, you raised a possible explanation on the voter side, so I think here's another possible alternative explanation on candidate incentive side for you to look at. So on Dr. Cheema's paper on these institutional reforms, I think just kind of zooming out and thinking about the context in which these reforms take place, and that they take place under a military regime, is important to consider because, and I think you say this, you articulate this very nicely in the paper, that these are reforms that are aimed to entrench the power of the quote-unquote the King's Party, which is a phenomenon that we see across, which we see again and again in the hybrid regime. And I think what we see in terms of the changes in incentives and sometimes the unintended consequences of the reforms, I find that oddly encouraging, because I think sometimes when we're talking about politics in Pakistan, we're overly deterministic about what can happen under a hybrid regime. And so the fact that reforms can also have these unintended consequences and that we can document those, I think tells us what the potential is for competition and accountability to emerge even when the cards are really, really stacked against it. Then I wanted to raise a question about the apportionment, the reapportionment, and I understand that why you're looking at general seats in particular, but a large part of the apportionment is an increase in reserved seats for women, right? And so I'm wondering whether there is a fueling of dynastic candidates into those reserved seats, and they sort of serve as this odd safety valve that reduces the incentives for the parties to then field dynastic candidates in new constituencies, which is a much costlier way of entering the legislature. And then I think finally, I would really say that this is both of these papers have been focused on dynasticism in the provincial and national legislatures, and I want to underscore the point of alongside the importance of dynasty, we are also seeing the importance of money to contest elections on both of these levels. And so thinking about how campaign finance figures in, and picking up on your point, Mariam, where you have campaign finance and how that happens across parties as important, I would be curious to kind of look at the role of the wealth of these dynastic families, and if the constraints imposed by financing that's required are so high, then I think we really do need to be looking at the local level as the place for inclusion and entrance of non-dynastic candidates. So I'll stop there, and then maybe everyone can have a chance to briefly respond to the discussant points, and then we'll open it up. Mariam, would you like to start?
So thank you, Umair, for your comments. You suggested that might we speculate on a theory of progression in elite careers? And that sort of work is being done. It's mostly happening in federal contexts in Western European countries. It is very difficult to do in Pakistan for the simple reason that tracking elite careers in Pakistan is complicated just by virtue of the fact that the Election Commission of Pakistan is incapable of getting the spellings of the candidates right, candidate names right. Okay, so if you have an Abdullah Shah in one constituency, that would be spelt in 20 different ways, right, in the constituency level data. And I have poured my head over this for the last 10 years and never been able to do a tracking that is accurate enough. Nonetheless, there is a paper that's coming up next year that was, in fact, co-authored by Samin, who's in the other room right now. And we do end up tracking the elite careers of cabinet ministers in Punjab and Sindh from the province, from the provincial and the national level. And what we find in Pakistan is that many of these cabinet ministers who do happen to be party heavyweights or constituency politicians, whatever you want to call them, tend to have alternate careers, which is a term that is used in the European literature, and the reason for that is that constituency politicians tend to have static ambition. They like to stay at the same level in the same constituency because that is their game, right? And they're not necessarily looking for that kind of movement. Now, we have seen movement, and we would think that in a hybrid regime like Pakistan's, you would have an integrative career where you're moving between levels and actually contesting elections at the level that is appropriate depending on who's in power, the military or the politicians. And in fact, that doesn't very well happen. It has happened in very rare circumstances, Yusuf Raza Gilani being an excellent example of where a constituency politician actually managed to showcase progressive ambition and become the prime minister of the country. But in other cases, it hasn't quite happened, and where it has happened, it's happened because either there's dynastic linkages, or in fact, quoting Dr. Malik's work on Piri Muridi and candidates who have these spiritual kinds of linkages, they are the ones who've managed to actually do that. So Shah Mahmood Qureshi can contest in Multan, but also in Kotki Sindh.
Right.
How in the world, right? So those are the candidates who can have integrative careers, but not otherwise. So therefore, coming up with a theory of that in Pakistan is very, very complicated. We attempted to do that in the paper. It ended up being a descriptive paper because we couldn't come up with a theory. But that's one thing. And the second, I don't know how to solve the problem of legislative voting because, as I said, in Pakistan, it's a show of hands. It's not, no one's actually counting votes. They only count votes when it comes to the no confidence motions, where they actually record yeses and nos. And that data is not shared by the Speaker of the National Assembly. And so, I mean, we don't, and there are not that many instances, right? The three confidence 3 or 4. I don't remember accurately. So, I mean, what will we do with that, right? So how, I mean, short of sitting in every single session, which FAFIN does and PILDAT does, right? Short of sitting in every single session, I don't know how we could actually understand legislative behavior. So at most, I know data on call attention notices, I know data on question answer periods, but beyond that, I don't know anything.
Great, I won't need it, yeah. Thank you. Very briefly, I'll respond to 2 of your key comments. So when elites are eliminated, there is obviously time for new elites to emerge. But perhaps that's where FATA is so different from the rest of the country we're talking about, that you don't have that sort of dynastic linkage or established family pedigree where one type of elite would replace another, or maybe members from within the family, especially in the wake of conflict. And when it comes to FATA reforms, they were really de jure reforms, and de facto hasn't changed much on the ground. Happened quite late in the process in 2018. There are indeed many other types of institutional heterogeneities, and absolutely, including princely states, right? So there were certain princely states. You talked about a whole range of other institutional arrangements. I guess where the difference would appear is in the type of conflict. What you find here is more sovereignty contesting forms of violence rather than sovereignty neutral. And those institutional heterogeneities perhaps would map on better to the type of outcomes that Ali and Faiz were talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sara, for the comments. So I will start from the paper you mentioned by George for India. So basically, what he did, he calculates a dynastic founder effect and a dynastic descendant effect. And he finds that a founder effect is positive on economic development than a descendant effect. What actually we are doing, we are also extending, trying to calculate, or you can say differentiate this founding effect from the descendant effect. And for this, we will need more observation, and we are extending this from the national constituencies to the provincial constituencies, and then we will see what effect is stronger in the case of Pakistan. However, generally, there is also a tendency that a non-dynast is a future dynast, actually. So if a politician wins 2 or 3 times, there is a high probability that he or she will develop a dynasty. So we are also working in this direction as well. Related to the close election, again, you are right that in this situation, basically we are comparing winners with winners. In a political science literature, in most of the studies, they are comparing winner with loser. So they are relatively easy to have an identification strategy. However, in the dynasties contest, we are comparing winner with winner. So generally, it decreases the number of observation by a very large number. Again, when we extend the scope to the provincial constituencies, so I hope it will overcome that problem. Thank you.
Sarah, I just going to respond to your last point in your comments on us. I think the campaign financing is central. I think you go to families because you are basically outsourcing the activity of conducting the election. But I think that constituency size has a big effect. So if you look at dynastic incidents at the provincial level, it is far, far lower because constituencies are smaller and therefore other candidates can emerge. They are still wealthier than the average population. So I think having a federated electoral structure, which takes into account basically the impacts on capture and persistence at this level is crucial for Pakistan's political debate.
Wonderful. Let's open it up for questions. Let's take 3 questions from this side. Dr. Bari, Mashal, and then over there.
Very quickly, the shock that you're looking at, did that change the way tribal areas were being administered as well? Did it provoke anything, for example? Because suddenly the state changed its thinking about who was a friend and who was a foe, and they were fighting a terror war. But does that mean that, did that have something to do with how FCR was being implemented? On Faisal, so over time, do these constituencies fall further behind compared to other constituencies? And what are the initial conditions from where because development might have economies of scale, scope, etc. And so to linearize that process is always hard. So how do you look at both initial effects, where they start from, and also over time, do they further go further away from each other, where you have high dynastic presence and low? And Ali, how about Ek to Senate? Like Sarah said, women, Senate seats. How are they? Is there any work that you can do from dynastic point of view in how the seats are allocated? But secondly, is it possible to think about residence and election and somehow breaking that link? What kind of impact would that have on breaking the dynastic politics?
Thanks for these presentations. My question is for Dr. Malik. So could you clarify a little bit what your dependent variable is theoretically? Because maybe I misunderstood, but I saw your story as being about, the mechanisms that you look at are trust in the state, for example. So I assume that your outcome variable is citizen violence against the state or conflict between citizens and the state. But the shock that you're looking at brought in a lot of foreign insurgents into FATA, and a lot of the violence that you're probably measuring is not violence that's committed by citizens. And so is this a story about a shock bringing in violence from foreigners, or is it a story about citizen-state relations coming from like a colonial legacy of certain types of rule?
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Muhammad Amir Khan. I'm a student of Constitutional Law from Punjab University. My question is from Adeel Malik. As you have mentioned, there is a huge trust deficit exists in the frontier governmentality, but we speak in the context of Pakistan, especially in the tribal belt. No doubt the story of FCR is ended after passing of 25th Constitutional Amendment. And similarly, you have mentioned the 9/11 has further increased the intensity of conflict. But what are those internal mechanisms that has been adopted by the state institutions? If I can just mention the constant military operations, the culture of enforced disappearances, the custodial torture, the kind of ordinances in the aid of civil powers, the application of sedition laws. Don't you believe these kind of structure that has replaced within the internal mechanism by the state, and who is the ultimate beneficiary of such kind of imperial or colonial model of governance? Thank you so much.
Let's actually take one more question there. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. My question is for Dr. Malik. So, sir, I did my thesis last semester on the same ungoverned spaces thing, under using the framework of Giorgio Agamben, set of exception. So, sir, the biggest hindrance I found, the limit I found in the research was that why the state has not yet been able to mainstream the ex-Fata region, even after expulsion of FCR. Does it have to do with the traditional political structure of those places? Because the people who reside there, the people of Fata, they have internalized the traditional setting of the politics there. That is to say, the tribal system, primarily the kinship, and these Malaks and feudal lord system. Please, if you can answer to that. And there's also way less data available on the same question, so if you have found anything. Thank you.
Dr. Malik, do you want to start? I think there's 3 questions on the table for you.
Sure. Thank you very much. They're all very good questions. I mean, there are a couple of questions effectively on the state's response. So there's a shock, 9/11 induced shock. That shock increases violence, but it also changes the way the state responds to those. And so we've tried to deal with some of those as competing explanations. So for example, you had drone attacks. That's more like a geopolitical response, but then military operations, which started. And so we found that, and there's data set, there's data, highly fine-grained data on both, and we find that both the drone attacks and the military operations actually peak in, after 2008, 2009 or 10. And so the story is one of intensification of violence, because if we were to restrict our analysis to pre-2009 or pre-2010, the results pretty much hold. In terms of violence, whether this violence, who perpetrates these violence, and in fact, feel free to come in. Faiz has also worked with me on this paper. The data set actually specifies who's claiming for that violence. And so we have information on who is actually which organization is perpetrating that violence. It is possible that that organization might have support from across the border, but they're clearly benefiting and instrumentalizing local conditions. So I think that is something we feel. There's another question about internalizing the structure. So this is a question more about what happens after the Fatah, which is not the main focus of our paper because our analysis really ends in 2019. But clearly there's a lot of literature in institutional economics that talks about path dependence, persistence of informal institutions, even when formal institutional structures are taken away. So there would clearly be a lot of that, but I think there's been a very strong demand for inclusion. And I have a feeling maybe Faiz could respond as well because he's from Fata region. It's less to do with how, what the nature of demands from those regions, more to do with the way the state has responded to those demands.
A few words on the data. So actually the Global Terrorism Database provides detailed information on the nature of the attack, type of the attack, who carried the attack. And interestingly, more than 90% of the attacks are carried out by the local militants, majority of them by the TTP. So if we say that, some of us can argue that some of the attacks, maybe a majority of the attacks may be from Afghanistan, but the data shows because majority of the attacks whose responsibility have been accepted by the local militants, more than 90%. And about the local citizen, basically we are using a variable that is attacks against the state targets. That is those attacks which have targeted government officials, government employees, schools, health facilities, utility infrastructure, etc. We are not including the attacks against the civilians or the non-state attack, which includes attacks against civilian businesses, etc. So these are only attacks against the state targets. And the question about Dr. Faisal, that what is the initial level of development and what happened over time. So basically, I think I couldn't put in a proper words. It basically, a dynasty also tries to provide some economic goods and services, public goods and services. So basically, we are comparing, I didn't show this, I didn't show in the slides, but at the descriptive level, if you see that if a dynast wins from a constituency 3 consecutive times, and in a close district, if in constituency, if a non-dynast wins, so the trajectory significantly changes. Both provides public goods and services, but the trajectory of the non-dynast is significantly different from that of the dynast.
Bhai Sahab, aapka the first question about Senate. So Senate is just like a handmaiden of parties. So nothing to be gained there. But I think the residence question is an important question, and that's the, these PR-based systems, they're not constituency-based systems. So there's literature which is showing that, in places where these systems came about, they had quite a big effect on shaving off dynastic advantage.
We can take a couple of more questions because we started late. Sayaf over here and then in the back.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Mariam Mufti. So given your typology of responsiveness to local needs and loyalty to party on which you base, the classification of candidates, assuming that responsiveness to local demands is responsiveness mostly to local public service delivery needs, how do you think greater decentralization would affect the selection procedure, given that a lot of, given that responsiveness to those, to constituent demands would become more salient than in local government elections? And do you think that means that national party politics and party affiliations would then become a greater part of candidate selection?
Thank you for that great talk. I had a couple of questions for Dr. Cheema and Dr. Rehman about dynastic politics. One is very closely related to the question that was just being asked about, about local government. Because 2002, 2001 was also the time when we, for the first time, saw serious experimentation with local government. And if the argument is to be hold true that the smaller the constituency, the greater the likelihood of a non-dynastic candidate coming in, do we see this gradual, do we see this throughout, sort of like the local government is the lowest and then it's sort of provincial, then it's national? Is this a fairly predictable gradation or not? So that's my first question. The second is there any way for us to parse out the impact dynasties have on the educational impact, sort of the learning aspect, because as I think you mentioned it briefly, but the, like Kawal ke gharane se to Kawal hi hoga. It's very hard for a Kawal from a non-Kawal gharana to be born. So how much of it is about this educational impact? How much of it is because of the capital impact? Is there any way for us to parse that out numerically and get a fair idea about it? Those are my two questions.
दूसरा वाला ले ले, मैं पहले वाला ले लेता. We can distribute. So on the so the local government thing is, the local government system is quite complicated. So there is, you're thinking about 2002, the mayoral election was an indirect election, and the electoral college of the mayor was essentially basically the union council mayors of the smaller unit. So it was completely captured. And what we see systematically over there was that the district mayoral election was captured by dynastic families, but not the UC mayorship. The second metric that I think is important is that if you look at women's elections at the local level, because they were direct elections under Musharraf, you had a very, you had women coming from a very different class and a very different background in that system relative to basically the indirect systems that are there at the provincial and national level. So Now, whether that was an electoral rule effect or, which has been a demand of women, but it's harder, for a sort of, if you have like a provincial level constituency that's hard to contest, or whether that was a local effect, I think we need more work on.
Dr. Mufti can have the last word.
Okay, so the question essentially is, does greater decentralization, does that allow for the expansion of local party organization, and is that going to have a bearing on candidate selection and have an impact on the types of candidates that are emerging? If candidate selection was done according to the formal principles that are written out into the party constitutions, perhaps. Okay, but that's not the story of candidate selection in Pakistan, right? And so when I started my presentation, I explained that this is part of a larger project. And one of the things that I point out is that actually candidate selection in Pakistan is happening based on completely informal mechanisms that have to be understood in addition to what's written in the party constitution, right? So when we examined candidate selection at the local level, Dr. Cheema is absolutely right. There are about 36% of the district Nazims in Punjab were dynasts, right? A good example would be the Nara family in Gujranwala. Another would be the example of Saira Afzal Tarar in Hafsabad. So there's a bunch of stories over there. Now, at the UC level, interestingly enough, what happens, at least in the elections that happen after 2010, I can't speak to the 2002-2001 case, but like after 2010, is that the UCs, for the most part, were not dynasts, but they were very much selected by the MNAs and the MPAs and were loyal to those MPAs and MNAs. And therefore, at the end of the day, it was not the political party who was selecting them, it was the MPA or the MNA. And so you have to trace back how those guys were selected. And those selections were done on the basis of electability and exclusive candidacy requirements, as opposed to what's actually written in the party constitution. So no, increased decentralization does not necessarily mean a greater investment in local party organization. But I will say this, that increased decentralization is going to have an impact, certainly, and it might result in certain kinds of progress. But when I think about party organization, when I think about increased investment in party organization, I'm actually thinking about how you can make candidate selection as a process in Pakistan a more multi-stage process where the constituencies can actually have a say in the candidate selection as opposed to it being determined by Imran Khan or Nawaz Sharif or Asif Ali Zardari, right? That's really what we should be
kind of a tack on to what Mariam was saying. So in the 2017 local government election, in many districts, basically, because everybody wanted to be a Noon League candidate. So the Noon League endorsed some candidates and did not. So the guys that weren't endorsed fought as independents, right? So that's a nice kind of like variation to see. And we tracked this in 2 districts, and almost 60% of the candidates that were endorsed by the party at the time of election lost. Right? Except what happened, that the guys, independents who won, joined the party later.
So, on the educational effect of dynasties, I didn't work on this aspect, but 2 of the papers by Dr. Adeel, if I'm wrong, please correct me. In one of the papers, he and his co-author studied the effect of religious dynasties on the literacy rate in Punjab, and they observed a significant negative effect of religious dynasties on the literacy rate. That is, religious dynasty decreased the literacy rate in their respective constituencies. And in the other paper, on the other dynasty, they also again observed a negative effect of a dynastic legislator in a constituency on the literacy rate or dropout rate.
Yeah, so sort of out-of-school children. Yes, sir.
All right, and with that, we will close the session and also the conference. So thank you, everybody, and my co-panelists. And